We're diving into a text that didn't just document history. It really shaped the very vocabulary we use to discuss race, identity, and the struggle for equality in America.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're talking about W.E.B. Du Bois's monumental 1903 treatise, The Souls of Black Folk.
A foundational text.
It really is. And, this is required reading, not because it's some dusty academic tome, but because it is this passionate, clear-eyed, intellectual declaration of independence for the 20th century African-American experience.
It's impossible to overstate its significance. And Du Bois was, well, he was the perfect person to author this declaration. He was born in 1868, right after the Civil War ended.
Right.
And unlike many African Americans of his time, he grew up with, a degree of privilege in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Crucially, he had access to an elite education.
He was the first African-American to get a PhD from Harvard.
From Harvard, exactly.
Wow.
And by the time he wrote Souls, he was already a pioneering sociologist. He'd published The Philadelphia Negro back in 1899, which is, it's a foundational work of urban sociology in its own right.
So what we have here is this unique intellect trained in the rigors of German historical sociology, but he's also rooted so deeply in the lived experience of this newly freed population.
Right.
Our mission today is to really extract that basic vocabulary and that foundational language, you could say the intellectual architecture that Du Bois gifted us for understanding African-American history and culture at that precise moment the 20th century began to define itself.
And Du Bois, he sets the scale immediately. Right in the forethought, he gives us that unforgettable, that crystal clear articulation of the challenge facing the nation.
The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line.
That's it, that one sentence. It's the thesis statement for the next 100 years of American history, and it becomes this uncompromising lens through which we have to examine every single facet of American democracy and economics.
So let's jump in and look at how he actually built that lens.
Yeah.
To grapple with the color line, Du Bois first had to give us the language to describe the sensation, the psychological and emotional reality of existing on the other side of that line.
Exactly.
This is where he moves from just being a sociologist to being, I think, a poet of the spirit.
Mm-hmm.
We really need to focus on these core intellectual contributions that provide the framework for the entire text.
And these concepts were revolutionary. They were revolutionary because they didn't just describe political oppression. They dove straight into the interior life. They gave African Americans a scholarly, a dignified framework for understanding the profound internal struggle for self-realization in what was, an incredibly hostile environment.
And it all starts with the most evocative image, the veil.
The veil.
It's so much more than just segregation. It's an entire system of visibility and invisibility. How does he illustrate the shock of its existence?
He roots it in a deeply personal, almost mundane anecdote from his own childhood in New England.
Right, he was a boy.
Just a boy, rollicking, as he says, exchanging gorgeous visiting cards with his classmates, participating fully in their world, until, and this is the moment, one girl, a tall newcomer, refused my card, refused it peremptorily with a glance.
The power of that is in its suddenness. It's not a slow dawning of prejudice, is it?
Not at all. It's a sudden, definitive revelation that just bursts upon him. In that moment, he realizes he is shut out from their world by a vast veil.
The world he thought he belonged to is suddenly completely closed off. It's the immediate, just visceral realization of difference.
And his first reaction is defiance. It's this youthful pride. He says he held all beyond it in common contempt and lived above it in a region of blue sky and great wandering shadows.
He tries to reject the world that rejected him.
He does, but that contempt, that youthful confidence, it can't hold. It just can't. He realizes the crushing truth. The worlds I longed for and all their dazzling opportunities were theirs, not mine.
So the veil isn't just a barrier.
No, it's a cosmic separation that dictates everything. Opportunity, access, your entire future.
And that kind of separation, it inevitably leads to an intellectual and a psychological distortion of the self. If you are constantly looking through a separating barrier, how do you even know what you truly look like?
Well, that's it. And this brings us directly to the next concept.
It's double consciousness.
This is maybe Du Bois' greatest single intellectual contribution. He defined it as the psychological sense experienced by African Americans. You possess an American identity, you are an American, but you're housed within a racial identity, a Negro. that the American nation fundamentally despises and fears.
So it's a war inside you.
It's a perpetual state of two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body. A constant internal conflict.
That phrase, two warring ideals, that gets right to the heart of it, doesn't it? It's the strife of trying to reconcile being fully human with being fully marginalized.
Yes. He talks about the black artisan who is fighting on one hand to escape the white contempt that sees him only as a mere hewer of wood and drawer of water, while at the same time he has to plow and nail and dig for a poverty-stricken horde.
That psychological tension must be debilitating. It just fragments the personality and drains all your energy.
And what's so fascinating here is the secondary definition of double consciousness, which speaks directly back to the veil.
How so?
Du Bois emphasizes this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. Black Americans are forced to see themselves only through the eyes of white Americans.
So they're measuring their own worth by the standards of a society that denies their worth.
Exactly. They are constantly looking at themselves not through their own innate value, but through the distorting mirror of the dominant white society, measuring their strength, their intelligence, their beauty by standards set by those who deny their humanity.
Okay, so if the veil creates the barrier, and double consciousness is the resulting psychological pain of seeing yourself through that barrier,
Yeah.
what's the solution? What's the political and cultural answer Du Bois proposed to overcome it?
That leads us to his third big idea, the vision of leadership. The talented tenth. Du Bois defined this as the leadership of the Negro race in America by a trained few. He envisioned this educated elite men of skill, light, and leading, often graduates of the new black colleges, who would serve as the vanguard of cultural and racial uplift.
So they weren't just meant to get rich.
No, not at all. They were intended to be missionaries of culture. Their job was to bring sophisticated thought and leadership back to the untaught masses. He believed that the masses needed sympathetic group leadership to navigate these really deep-seated economic and social disadvantages.
Well, wait a minute. Isn't that inherently elitist? Doesn't that risk replacing one elite, the oppressive white power structure, with another college-educated black elite? How did he justify that approach to democracy?
He justified it by necessity. He saw it as the only viable route to freedom given the historical context at that time.
It's pragmatic.
Very pragmatic. His argument was, look, if the purpose of education is to produce teachers, doctors, lawyers, and leaders, you can't start with industrial training for everyone. You have to first train the thinkers, the people who can organize and who can teach. The masses needed models and spokespeople who could master modern civilization and, negotiate with the dominant society.
That makes sense historically, especially given the profound lack of educational infrastructure right after slavery.
Right.
However, we have to provide the crucial context here that Du Bois himself, later in life, critically reassessed and essentially disavowed this theory.
He did. It's a really important point.
So why did his thinking shift?
It shifted as his political focus moved. He went from thinking about assimilation and cultural uplift toward these broader issues of class and global anti-colonialism. He began to recognize that class divisions within the black community could mirror the elitism of the white power structure.
So he saw the talented 10th sometimes becoming too self-serving.
Exactly. Too removed from the grinding poverty of the sharecroppers and industrial laborers, and because of that, they were unable or maybe unwilling to effectively lead the masses in a more revolutionary kind of change. It was a complex evolution in his thought. He realized that leadership must emerge from the masses rather than just be imposed upon them. So that intellectual framework of the veil and double consciousness, it really sets the stage for the book's central political conflict.
Right. It's philosophical showdown.
The showdown between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, which he details in the chapter of Mr. Booker T. Washington and Others.
And this wasn't just a disagreement between two thinkers. This is a battle for the soul and the strategy of an entire race at a really crucial historical moment.
A total crossroads.
So why did Washington rise to such dominance at that specific moment around, say, 1876?
Well, Washington's ascendancy coincided with a significant national psychological shift. The ideals of the Civil War and Reconstruction, that fervor for racial equality, were, as Du Bois says, rapidly passing.
The country was tired.
The country was tired, and it had turned its attention almost entirely to astonishing commercial development.
Yeah.
It was concentrating all its energies on the pursuit of dollars. The nation was exhausted by the race question, and Du Bois puts it so well, a little ashamed of having bestowed so much sentiment on Negroes.
So Washington comes along and presents a perfect solution for the white power structure.
A perfect solution. He came with a simple, definite program, emphasizing three things that appealed directly to industrial capitalism and, frankly, to Southern comfort.
Which were?
Industrial education, conciliation of the South, and crucially, submission and silence as to civil and political rights.
That's the key. Du Bois correctly labels this approach a gospel of work and money.
And while industrial education itself wasn't new, I mean, free Negroes and abolitionists had been promoting trade schools for a long time, it was Washington's framing of it as the only immediate necessity, coupled with his willingness to forego immediate political demands.
That made him acceptable.
It made him acceptable to wealthy white Northern philanthropists and to the segregationist South. His 1895 Atlanta Compromise speech just cemented his status as the spokesperson for the entire race. He essentially promised social separation in exchange for economic opportunity.
And that is the absolute core of Du Bois' critique. He argues that Washington's policy, quote, practically accepted the alleged inferiority of the Negro races.
Yes, and that it strategically withdrew many of the high demands of Negroes as men and American citizens.
For Du Bois, this was a profound surrender of dignity, a huge step backward.
It was. He observed that in nearly all other histories of oppressed groups, their leaders preached that manly self-respect is worth more than lands and houses. So why, he asked, should the Negro be the exception to that rule?
And he didn't just stop at a philosophical disagreement. He went on to detail the damaging, the quantifiable consequences of what he called Washington's tender of the palm branch, this policy of conciliation.
He lays out three specific detrimental outcomes that really accelerated during Washington's period of influence.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, the widespread and systemic disenfranchisement of the Negro. This is the period that saw the rise of Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, all of it designed specifically to strip black men of the vote.
And Du Bois argued that Washington's silence on political rights enabled this.
It absolutely did. Second, the legal creation of a distinct and rigid status of civil inferiority.
Full-blown segregation.
The full establishment of segregation in every single facet of public life. Again, the conciliation policy suggested that these social restrictions were acceptable as long as some economic progress was possible.
And the third consequence directly undermined Du Bois' own vision.
It did. The steady withdrawal of aid from institutions for the higher training of the Negro. If the only acceptable education was industrial, then schools like Fisk and Atlanta, which focused on liberal arts and training teachers, they suffered financially. It threatened the very existence of the intellectual leadership Du Bois felt was so essential.
So this is why Du Bois saw Washington's program not just as some alternative path, but as politically corrosive.
Yes, it was actively enabling the system of oppression it claimed to be bypassing. And to break down the philosophical flaw even further, Du Bois labeled Washington's underlying propositions as dangerous half-truths.
Let's break those down. Washington argued, one, that the South is justified in its hostile attitude because of the current degradation of the Negro population. Two, that the Negro's failure is due to a past wrong education, meaning too much academic focus, not enough trade skills.
And third.
And three, that the future rise of the race depends primarily on self-effort and property accumulation.
So Du Bois meticulously reveals the supplementary truths that these half-truths just completely ignore.
So on the first point, blaming the victim.
Exactly. Washington completely ignores the persistence of slavery and centuries of ingrained, violent race prejudice as sufficient causes for the Negro's plight. You cannot blame the victim for the conditions created by the oppressor.
And what about the second point, about the wrong education?
Du Bois provides a brilliant counter-historical argument. He insists that industrial and common school training couldn't possibly succeed until a generation of black teachers and leaders had been trained first.
You need teachers before you can have schools.
It seems obvious, right? He states plainly that a Tuskegee was unthinkable before 1880 because you needed college-trained individuals to lead, organize, and teach those industrial skills. Higher education was the necessary precursor, not some kind of luxury.
And finally, this over-reliance on self-effort alone.
Du Bois agreed that the Negro must strive mightily. That was a given. But he insisted that success is impossible unless that striving is not simply encouraged, but actively aroused and encouraged by the initiative of the richer and wiser environing group.
So without external support from the white community.
Without white society upholding justice, granting political rights, and funding higher education, the striving would be in vain. The odds were just too stacked against them.
This philosophical conflict brings us back to Du Bois's broader educational ideal. He believed that framing the debate as trades versus liberal arts was just foolish. Why?
Because it's a false dichotomy. It's a false choice. The answer is neither and both.
Right.
Du Bois argued that the goal of training should be comprehensive, to make carpenters of carpenters and philosophers of philosophers. You train the worker to work with skill and dignity, and you train the thinker to think critically and lead justly.
Because limiting education to just industrial skills.
It wasn't just short-sighted, it prepared the black man only to serve the white man's economy, not to lead his own people or participate fully in a complex democracy.
And ultimately, for him, the goal of education transcends just getting a job.
Absolutely. The goal is not to earn meat, but to know the end and aim of that life which meat nourishes. The necessary ideals have to be pursued at the same time. Work, culture, liberty, all these we need, not singly but together, not successively but together, each growing and aiding each.
So to separate the pursuit of economic stability from the pursuit of political rights and cultural expression is, in his view, to destroy the possibility of true human flourishing.
Exactly. You can't have one without the others.
Du Bois' critique of the choices being made in 1903 is really built on a deep analysis of the great political and economic failures that immediately followed emancipation.
That's right.
Which brings us to the first and maybe the most tragic experiment in government intervention. The Freedmen's Bureau. It was established between 1865 and 1872.
And the Bureau didn't just spring up overnight. It was the formalization of these varied early systems that emerged during the war, like the experiments in self-governance in Port Royal, South Carolina, or the labor systems run by generals in Louisiana.
So after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Congress basically struggled with how to transition 4 million people from chattel slavery to citizenship.
It was an unprecedented challenge. A bill was finally passed over President Andrew Johnson's second veto in July 1866, which made the Bureau a major symbol of the radical vision for Reconstruction.
And those vetoes from Johnson are crucial context.
Absolutely. He saw the Bureau as an unconstitutional expansion of federal power and as a way to centralize control over labor in the South. He argued that it favored the newly freed population far too much. The political hostility was baked into the Bureau from the very start.
And the scope of this singular bureau was just staggering.
Absolutely staggering. Du Bois described it as a de facto government in the South. It was tasked with handling all subjects relating to refugees and freedmen. I mean, that's a truly impossible mandate.
And you think about the logistics.
It's mind-boggling. It managed millions of dollars. It distributed 21 million rations to both black and white Southerners who were facing famine. It operated 60 hospitals, provided medical care, and created these incredibly complex labor contracts, 50,000 in a single state alone.
And in many areas, it was the only court system.
It acted as the only functional court where Negroes were recognized to testify or seek any kind of justice. It was trying to rebuild an entire society from the ground up while under constant bitter attack from white Southerners who just refused to accept the notion of free black citizens.
It seems like it was almost foredoomed to fail, given the sheer difficulty and the hostility of the environment it was operating in.
It was, and yet it did achieve one monumental success that Du Bois really championed, which he called the Ninth Crusade.
The Ninth Crusade.
Its greatest enduring success was in planting the free school among Negroes and establishing the very idea of universal elementary education in the South.
And this was primarily spearheaded by dedicated Northern abolitionists and teachers.
Often the famed New England schoolma'ams in their calico dresses. They faced threats, they faced violence, but they taught over 100,000 souls in the first year alone. It's an incredible story.
And this crusade was instrumental in founding major institutions that are still with us today. Fisk, Atlanta, Howard, Hampton, among others.
It was. Du Bois notes that $6 million were expended on education, and over 700,000 of that was contributed by freedmen themselves out of their meager, often non-existent savings.
Which just demonstrates the immense hunger for knowledge.
A profound hunger. But politically and economically, the Bureau's legacy was one of profound failure and, frankly, betrayal. Du Bois highlights two specific betrayals that destroyed capital, both financial and emotional.
The first failure was the thwarted promise of 40 acres and a mule.
Right. The expectation of land ownership was a righteous and reasonable ambition, as Du Bois notes, but the 800,000 acres of abandoned lands that the Bureau held were intended for immediate distribution.
And they melted quickly away.
They melted away after President Johnson granted general amnesty to former Confederates, which allowed them to reclaim their property. Du Bois calls this the death of the black peasant's hope. He describes the day the Bureau commissioner had to tell the weeping freedmen, who had already settled and planted crops, that their land was not theirs.
Devastating. Land ownership was the only path to true independence. Without it, they were forced right back into dependence.
And the second betrayal was the catastrophic collapse of the Freedmen's Bank. This was an institution that had the explicit prestige of the government and a seemingly reputable board. It encouraged thrift and savings among black folk.
And freedmen deposited over $57 million. Hard-earned money saved from their very first wages.
But the bank was just riddled with corruption and mismanagement, largely by white officials and speculators, and it led to a crash.
And Du Bois argues that this failure destroyed so much more than just dollars.
Oh, much more. It destroyed all the faith in saving and much of the faith in men. The nation never truly rectified this loss, and the lesson learned by the freed people was simple and devastating. Do not trust the American financial system.
And this political and financial catastrophe leads directly into the economic reality that Du Bois chronicles at the turn of the century.
It does. He takes us into the Black Belt of Dougherty County, Georgia, as a detailed case study illustrating the complete economic failure of freedom. The keynote of the Black Belt, he writes, is one word: debt.
And this debt was systemic. It was a direct heritage of the slave system, but then compounded by the disastrous fall of cotton prices.
A huge drop, from a high of 14 cents per pound in 1860 down to a crushing 4 cents in 1898. Land values plummeted, but the debt remained, creating this permanent financial crisis for the entire region.
This crisis then gives birth to the system of peonage and economic slavery.
Yes. Without land or capital, 94% of the black population in this area struggled for land and failed. They were forced into the cropland system, working the land as tenant farmers or sharecroppers, or as Du Bois uses the older term, métayer.
Let's clarify that term, métayer. It's a French term, basically meaning a tenant farmer or sharecropper.
Right. And the system itself was fundamentally predatory. The métayer had to rent land and, critically, borrow money or supplies, seed, tools, flour, bacon from the furnishing merchant or the landowner before the crop was even planted.
And that's where the debt cycle becomes an inescapable trap.
It's a total trap. Renters paid up to a third of their meager crop yield in rent, plus they paid interest, often exorbitantly high on the supplies they had to purchase on credit.
And he gives that specific, almost unbelievable example of a man renting a $40 mule for $20 a year.
It's a 50% annual rental fee just for the animal you need to work the fields. The system guaranteed that the sharecropper would end the year owing more than they earned.
It was literal forced labor, or peonage.
It was. Du Bois notes that if a peon should run away, the local sheriff, who was elected exclusively by white suffrage, would catch the fugitive. Or if the individual crossed county lines, a charge of petty thieving would secure his return.
This systemic injustice must have been utterly destructive to any ambition.
Completely. The black laborer learned that it simply does not pay to be careful when every single penny of profit is swallowed by debt and interest. The result was often carelessness, improvidence, and shiftlessness,
Which were then used by the white community as proof of inherent racial inferiority.
conveniently masking the fact that the system itself was designed to steal any surplus wealth.
And this economic serfdom was perfectly mirrored by the failure of civic life.
Absolutely. Black men had virtually no voice in government, a clear case of taxation without representation, where their taxes funded white schools and white infrastructure. Law and justice weren't protective. They were viewed as sources of humiliation and oppression.
The system was so distorted that the state actually needed criminals.
The state needed criminals to eke out its income by their forced labor through the convict leasing system.
And this relentless pursuit of wealth of dollars at the expense of human life and dignity is where Du Bois implicitly introduces the concept that informs his conclusion: mammonism.
Yes, the idolatry of wealth. The pursuit of material gain as the sole measure of value, which the nation fully embraced after the Civil War. This mammonism allowed white society to rationalize the systemic theft of black labor and political rights.
Du Bois captures the tragic human toll of this system so perfectly by contrasting two types of oppressed souls.
He does.
On one hand, you have the shiftless laborer who has internalized the hopelessness of the debt trap and just gives up striving.
And on the other hand, you have the bitter, defiant farmer, A man who watched his parents get whipped in the cotton rows and declares, "Let a white man touch me and he dies."
This is the psychological boiling point, the tragic result of a system that denies both economic justice and personal dignity. We shift now from the external world of economic brutality to the inner sanctum of the oppressed. We're exploring the culture, the faith, and the emotional life that sustained the people living behind the veil.
Right.
And we have to start with the power of faith, which he explores in the faith of the fathers.
Dubois argues that the Black church is the single most characteristic expression of African American character and the indispensable social center of Negro life.
Indispensable.
Because African Americans were systematically cut off from the economic, social, and political worlds of white society because of color prejudice. So the church became a microcosm of the world they were denied.
It had to serve every function. It was the bank, the social club, the political forum.
The entertainment venue, the moral center, the welfare organization. It was this powerful conserver of morals and family life, and it served as the final arbiter of what was good and right within the community. In the South, Dubois notes, practically every American Negro is a church member.
And to illustrate its power, he recounts his first exposure to a Southern revival,
which was a world away from the quiet, intellectual observance he knew in New England. He describes approaching this little church and sensing the air of intense excitement and a sort of suppressed terror that lent terrible reality to song and word. It was a space of release and profound emotional communion.
That Southern revival experience he analyzed was characterized by three unique, inseparable elements. First, the preacher.
This was a unique personality developed by the Negro on American soil. At once, a leader, a politician, an orator, and a passionate idealist. He had to embody the community's hopes and fears.
Second, the music.
This was the plaintive rhythmic melody, which, despite having been often caricatured, remains, in his words, the most original and beautiful expression of human life and longing, yet born on American soil.
It was sorrow transmuted into hope.
Yes. And third, the frenzy or shouting. This was the mad abandon of physical fervor, often misunderstood by outsiders, but considered essential by practitioners for true communion with the invisible.
It was a necessary emotional release.
A necessary release from the crushing reality of the veil. It was a space where the soul could momentarily escape the constraints of economic serfdom.
And the music, of course, is so powerful that it earns its own dedicated chapter, the sorrow songs.
It does, and Dubois elevates this music from mere folk tunes into a profound spiritual heritage. He recognizes its deep universal value.
He calls these songs the rhythmic cry of the slave, standing as the sole American music and the nation's singular spiritual heritage.
And they perform a critical function. They stand as a heart-touching witness against the false historical claim that slave life was joyous, careless, and happy.
They're historical documents. They tell of trouble and exile, of strife and hiding. They are the unwritten history of the people.
And their power was made visible to the world through the singer's story. This is the remarkable story of the Fisk Jubilee Singers.
Founded in 1871.
Led by George L. White, 4 boys and 5 girls, they embarked on this impossible pilgrimage. They fought cold and starvation, were frequently shut out of hotels, and often endured hostile audiences. But they sang their spirituals across the land and across the sea before Queen and Kaiser.
And they made the sorrow songs known globally, giving them the recognition they deserved as high art, while also achieving a really tangible practical goal.
A huge goal. Raising a monumental $150,000, an extraordinary sum for that era, to found Fisk University in Nashville. It's just a stunning testament to the power of cultural capital to build intellectual capital.
And the lineage of this pain, Dubois emphasizes, is ancient.
It is. He connects the sorrow songs to an ancient echo found in his own lineage. His ancestor, seized by a Dutch trader 2 centuries before, crooned a song that traveled down through the generations. Dubanakoba, Jean Me,
which is a Wolof song, likely about captivity.
And it translates to, get me out, get me out. Dubois calls it simply the voice of exile. It is the persistent cry for freedom, echoing through 200 years of history.
As the book draws to a close, Dubois uses these individual narrative figures to illustrate the human cost of the veil. He moves the argument from sociological critique to just deeply affecting human tragedy.
Consider Josie, who he features in Of the Meaning of Progress. She represents the quiet, widespread destruction of thwarted aspirations.
She loved learning. She longed for higher education, hoping to escape the monotony and poverty of the farm.
But the financial demands and the narrow reality of the Black Belt
just denied her that opportunity. She returned to the hard, narrow reality of farm labor and ultimately died young. She's one of the many women in the text whose yearning for intellectual and self-expression is permanently silenced by the system.
And then there's the figure of John, of the coming of John, who represents the conflict between the educated elite and the masses who remain behind.
Right. John, armed with a northern education, returns south, but he can no longer connect with his community. When he tries to address the black church congregation, he spoke an unknown tongue.
His intellectual language had become alien to the spiritual language of the community.
Exactly. And he was furiously denounced by the old preacher for trampling on the true religion. That psychological disconnection is then compounded by the racial tension he now sees with new, educated eyes.
And when the white John, the local judge's son, attempts to dishonor John's sister, Jenny,
the black John, in a surge of pent-up hatred and defense, murders him. This act of violence, born of protecting his sister's dignity, is followed immediately by the black John's own death at the hands of a lynch mob.
the death of the gifted black man, killed for defending a woman's honor, becomes the ultimate price of the veil.
And this tragic arc culminates in the most personal chapter of The Passing of the Firstborn, where Dubois recounts the death of his own infant son. It is a devastating moment of clarity and sorrow.
He held his infant son, who was born with olive-tinted flesh and dark gold ringlets, and immediately saw the shadow of the veil fall across him.
He felt a vague unrest, knowing his child would grow up forced to hold the unbowed pride of a hunted race, in a land where liberty was, for black men, often a mockery.
And when the child died, Dubois confessed to feeling an awful gladness in his heart. He whispered that his son was not dead, but escaped, not bond, but free.
He believed his child had escaped the fate of having his soul grow choked and deformed within the veil. It's a stunning, heartbreaking, emotional conclusion. That for a father facing the reality of Jim Crow America, death might be a preferable alternative to a life of studied humiliations and constant psychological strife.
The private grief just perfectly mirrors the public tragedy.
Yeah.
Rereading the souls of black folk, it's just undeniable that Dubois created a monumental legacy, not just for its historical witness, but for the intellectual vocabulary he provided.
Oh, absolutely.
We are still using the language he created. Double consciousness, the veil.
We are. The book was a seismic event. It provided the foundational language for scholars, writers, and activists for decades. Its profound focus on cultural and artistic expression made it a crucial forerunner to the Harlem Renaissance.
And politically.
Politically, the philosophy of demanding civil, political, and social rights catalyzed the Niagara Movement in 1905, which Dubois founded, and which then quickly evolved into the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, in 1909. His intellectual challenge shifted the entire political debate.
And bringing this back to Dubois' final synthesis, he insisted that the black population's striving cannot and should not rely on white America to assume the necessary sympathetic leadership.
Precisely. He argued that the necessary social teaching, example, and guidance must come from the blacks themselves.
And this required men of skill and light, the college-bred men.
The college-bred men who could thoroughly comprehend and know modern civilization and take hold of Negro communities to raise and train them. The economic and political systems of the South were just too corrupted by race prejudice and greed, by the rule of the unscrupulous, to allow for effective outside guidance.
Dubois' conclusion, despite all the striving and sacrifice he witnessed and chronicled, remains devastatingly clear. The Negro is not free.
Still not free. The legacy of the Freedmen's Bureau, its failures and its thwarted promises, remains the heavy heritage of this generation, a testament to the nation prioritizing wealth over justice.
He fundamentally warned that the temptation of Hippomenes, the pursuit of the golden apples, threatened to woo black folk away from a strife for righteousness, from a love of knowing, to regard dollars as the be-all and end-all of life.
This focus on mammonism, this immoral pursuit of wealth, was the national disease that made Booker T. Washington's concessions palatable and derailed the quest for full humanity.
So, we leave you with this provocative thought, looking back at the dawn of the 20th century and forward into our own. Dubois held out the ideal for men to one day judge men by their souls and not by their skins. Given the persistence of inequality and the intense focus on financial valuation in every sector of modern life, what is the modern equivalent of the golden apples of mammonism today? What distracting quest for immediate material gain or corporate metric is threatening to derail that essential human quest for truth and freedom and broad humanity? What are we collectively stooping for right now that sacrifices the soul for the sake of the dollar?